Hello and welcome. In this lesson, we'll be adding authentication to our bookstore application. We're going to do that by adding a route for registration, a route for logging in, and then we're going to authenticate the book routes. And what that we achieve is that a user who is not logged in or who is not authenticated will not have access to the book routes. So let's dive right into it. On the register route, what we'll be doing basically would be to create a new user to store the user's password from the request and also create a token for the user, which the user can now begin to use in their API requests. So let's start by um, creating our user model in, or rather our user schema in the models folder. You remember in this project that we have refactored our application to have this structure, controllers, database setup, models, and then our routes. So let's start by creating the user schema in this folder. In the models folder, I'm going to create a new file called user.js. And in this file, I'm going to be defining the user schema. So let's start by saying const mongoose equals require mongoose, and then const schema equals mongoose, and then const user schema equals the new schema. And now we want to define what the user should look like. So we want the user to have a first name. Let's make this a required field. So type string required is true. Last name, same thing, type string required true. Also, let's have a username, type string required is true. And lastly, let's have the password, type string required true. Okay, so let's add some other validations to the username field. For the authentication to be effective, you want each user to have a unique username. You do not want two users having the same username. So what we can do to enforce that would be unique true. So what this would do would be to create an index for the username field in the users collection. So if I create a new user and I go to my Mongo shell and I fetch indexes, you would see the username index being registered as part of the indexes in the user collection. Okay, so lastly, let's make all usernames to be in lowercase. So we do that by saying lowercase true, and that would solve it. All right, so like I can save this, and then I can end by saying module.exports equals mongoose dot model user from the user schema. So I'm going to save this, and now we can use this schema to create new users and do all of that. So the next thing we want to do now is to create a controller. Remember that our controllers are the request and response functions which would pass in to our routes. So we're going to create a controller for the authentication process. So I'm going to create a new file called authcontroller.js inside the controllers folder. And the first thing I'll do would be to require the user model. User equals require. I'm going to navigate to the models folder and to user.js. Okay, so now I can begin to create my controller functions. So let me start by creating the function to register the new user. I'm going to do that by saying exports dot register new user equals to this function request response, and I can now do all of my logic inside this function. So let's highlight the steps we're going to use in this function. We're going to fetch the user's details from request body. Then we're going to check if a user with this username exists. So what we want to do is to ensure that before the user creation starts, um, we can know if there is an existing user with that username, so that that can be validated very early on. So the next thing we want to do, if there is no user with that username, we want to create a new user. And when we create a new user, we'll remember to hash user's password, then save password to database, and then we're going to create token, create JWT for user, and then we're going to send the token to user. Okay, so now let's start by fetching the user's details from request body. So, and then we check if a user with this username exists. So to do that, what we just need to do is to use user.find, find one, and if the username is the same as request.body.username, and if there's a user that matches this, that means that the username already exists. You would notice, for example, if you want to create a Facebook account and you try to use an existing email address, it will tell you that an account already exists with that email address. So that's what we're trying to do. So we want to first check if there's a user with this username, and if there is, let's add the callback error and existing user. So if there's an error, let's just return rest.status 500.json error else. Okay, this should be an arrow function. Else, if existing user, if there's an existing user what we want to do is to send back a response res.status for let's just make it a 400 error dot json, and the message will be that the user already exists. A user with this username already exists. Else, if there's okay, I don't need the else statement since I'm returning. In fact, I do not need this else statement, so I can just clean this up like this. So if there's an error, return this. If there's an existing user, return this. And so now at this point, if the code gets to this point, it means the user there is no user with this username on the database. So now we can create the new user. So we can now say user dot create, and we can now see first name is request.body dot first name, last name is request.body dot last name, and then the username is requests dot body dot username. I want to be sure we're not missing anything. First name, last name, username, and password. Okay, so the last part is the password, which we will not add just yet. So user.create this, and then we can add a callback error, new user, and if there's an error, let me just copy this to use here. If there's an error, return res.status 500.json error. Now we are past this, we've created a new user. Now we need to hash the user's password. So to hash the user's password, we'll use the bcrypt module. So let's just head to our terminal to install the bcrypt module and the JSON Web Token for creating JWTs. So I'm going to pause here and head back to my terminal. And on my terminal, I'm going to install bcrypt.js and also JSON Web Token. Okay, so while that is running, I'm going to head back to VS Code and just require them ahead. So const bcrypt equals require bcrypt.js, and also const jwt equals require JSON Web Token. And then if the user has been created at this point, we want to hash the password coming from the request body. And after hashing the password, we want to save it to the user's data, and then we want to create a token for that user and send that token back to the user. So the next thing we want to do is hash the user's password. So let me put that here. So hash the user's password. Now we want to say bcrypt dot gensort. I believe you remember this process, and that will take a number. So let's just say 10. And then we add our callback function, which will take in error or the salt. And if there's an error, let's just return this. Else, we're going to use the salt to hash the common password from the request body. So we want to say bcrypt dot hash, and what we want to hash is the request dot body dot password, and we want to hash it with the salt. And then we can now add our callback function, error hashed password. And if there's an error, let's just do the same. Otherwise, we can now save this password to the user's data. So let me put this here. Otherwise, we can now save the password to the user's data. So we'll do that by saying new user dot password equals hashed password, and then we can save the new user dot save. And again, so in subsequent times, you would learn to do this in an asynchronous way without having to always pass in the error callback all the time, because as you can see, our code is becoming quite messy. A lot of error callbacks that we're having to pass. So in subsequent times, you learn how to do this asynchronously using the async and await. But for now, let's just stick with callbacks so that the process is well understood. So new user.save, and this will take a callback error saved user. And if there's an error, again, let's just return the error. Otherwise, that means we've gotten to this point where we can now create token and send the token to the user. Let me place this here. All right, so now we can create JWT for the user by saying, okay, before that, let's create a variable const secret equals a string. Let's call it very secure secrets, and let's make the expiry to be let's just say 3600. So in seconds, that will mean each user will only be able to log in for 1 hour, which is 3600 seconds. All right, so let's skip that for now. And then I can head back here and say jwt.sign, and we want the payload to be ID, or rather, let's just use ID is, let me make it a little more legible. So let's make ID to be the ID of the user. So new user.id, and then the username to be new user.username, and first name to be new user dot first name, and last name to be new user dot last name. Okay, so remember that you should not add sensitive information to the payload. So things like password, I would not add that to the payload. All right, so this is just what will be in the payload: the ID, the username, the first name, and the last name of that user. So I'm going to add the next argument, which will be the secret. So secret, and then options. In options there, I can now have expires in, and have that to be the expiry variable here. Okay, and then I can add a callback function that takes in the error and token, and if there's an error again, let's just return it to the user. Else we're going to just send back a message to the user. So let's just say return res.status 200.json message user registration successful, and we want to also send back the token, which the user can now begin to use in their API requests. So I'm going to save this. So now we've been able to create a function that will create the user by first checking if that user, if a user with that username exists, and if not, it will create a new user with the information coming from our request. And after creating that user, we're going to hash the password that was sent in the request body. And after hashing the password, we'll save the password to the user's data here. And after saving that, we'll sign the payload, JWT payload, which contains the user's ID, username, first name, and last name. And after signing that, we'll send back a success message to the user, and then the JWT token that was generated. Okay, now I believe that was a handful. So let's just go to the routes folder to create our register routes or sign up routes, if you would. So I'm going to create a new file in the routes folder called, let's call it authroutes.js. And in the authroutes.js, I'm going to require the express module first equals require express, and then I'm going to require, or I'm going to call the router function equals express dot router, and then I'm going to require the controller function which we created here. So I'm going to say const. Of course, I can do this in a number of ways. I can say const auth controller equals require, and then I can navigate to the controller file, controllers slash auth controller, and in this object you can now see that I would have the register new user function. So I can go ahead to say router dot post slash sign up. Let's call the route sign up route. And then we can now add a function auth controller dot register new user, and exports the router module dot exports. And now I can head back to and just say const auth routes equals require dot slash routes slash the auth routes, and then I can say app dot use auth routes. If you want to have a prefix before all of the auth routes, for example, you want to have slash auth slash something in front of all of the auth routes, you can do that by saying app.use and then add the prefix as the first argument. So for example, slash auth. So that will mean all auth routes will be appended with slash auth before the routes. So let's clean this up a little bit, and let's just say routes require routes, and okay, so I'm going to save this and also save this. Okay, now I need to start up my server. I'm going to head over to my terminal and run no daemon app index.js, or rather source slash index.js, and I'm going to give that some seconds to start up. And once that is done, we're going to head over to Postman to send a post request to our sign up routes. Okay, so that's taking some seconds. Just to be sure, we're making the post request to slash sign up. Okay, and then I can open Postman, and let me just type in the address while the server is still starting up. So I'm going to create a new tab on Postman, and then post request to localhost 3000. I believe we're on port 3000. We're on port 4000. Pardon me, 4000. So slash auth slash sign up. In the request body, we're using the raw format and specifically JSON. So let's send first name, and let's call that Jerry, and last name, let's make that Tom. Username, let's make it Jerry Tom 102, and then password, let's make that my secure password. Okay, let's see if our server is up. All right, our server is up. Now let's send this request and let's see what happens. Okay, we seem to have an error. No, we don't. Localhost 4000. Okay, it's localhost with one C. All right. Okay, we have an error that says password is required, and that will be because in our controller the password is not saved. Okay, all right, so I need to remove the required validation here, and that is because when we're calling user.create here, it expects a password to be here too. So let's just take that off for now. Okay, and then the server should be restarted, and once that is up, we can send the request again. Okay, this is taking a little long. Let me collapse this a little so that we can see the response almost immediately. Now it's up. Okay, so now let's send the requests again, and now it says the user registration is successful, and then it sends back the token. Okay, so let's try creating a user without, okay, with the same details, and let's see what happens. And we get an error. A user with this username already exists, so that is because we have this check on line 14 here. Okay, so I think this explains how the register route is going to work. So we can create a new user again. We can register a new user. Let's call this new user power last name puff, and let's make the username power puff girls, and this password, let's make it power. And I'm going to send this request again, and user registration is successful. And if we head over to our Mongo shell, let me open the Mongo shell, and once I open the Mongo shell, I'm on this database. I'm on the book app database. So let's check the book app database, use book app, and then let's say db.users.find, and now you can see the users, the ones we just created, Jerry, Tom, the username and the password, and then the second one, powerpuff, and then the password. And as you can see, the passwords are hashed, so they are not saved in plain text. All right, so, and also like I mentioned, if I try to show you the indexes. um, db dot users dot show indexes, I think. Oh no, it's not. It should be db. Okay, let's check what the show index command is. I seem to have forgotten. It should be db dot users dot um it should be get indexes. Okay, dot get indexes. Now you can see um, the indexes we have: username and ID. So the same way each user is going to have a unique ID, each user is always also going to have a unique username.